Hey guys, welcome to day 10 of Intellipaat's DevOps week. And in this session, we're going to look into a DevOps tool called Nexus Repository. So before, in the previous session, we looked into Excel deploy. So in this session, we're going to look into a different DevOps tool. Now, without any further delays, let's look into the agenda. First, we'll start off by understanding what is an artifact. Once that is done, we'll look into what is Nexus Repository. And after that, we'll be looking into the use cases of Nexus Repository. Finally, we'll do a comparison between JFrog and Nexus to understand the differences. And then we'll show you how to install Nexus Repository. Once you've successfully installed, you can check out the next part of the session, which is a Nexus Repository hands-on, so that you could get hands-on experience on the same. So that would be the last part of this session.
So before moving on with the session, please subscribe to our channel.
And also hit the bell icon for the upcoming updates from our channel. And also, if you enjoy our content, you can leave a like.
Let's understand what an artifact actually is. The files that contain both the compile code and the resources that are used to compile them are known as artifacts. Basically, whenever a developer writes his source code, he gives it to a build tool so that the build tool can compile that source code into binary code. This is because whenever a developer writes source code, he writes it in the language that humans can understand, a human language. But machines can't understand that language. To make it understandable for machines, the build tool compiles it so that it's converted into a binary code, that is ones and zeros, that can be easily understood by machines. When these binary codes are taken together with the dependencies and resources that are required to run it and put together into one file or packaged into one file, that one file is known as an artifact. Basically, these are readily deployable files, like an executable. In Java, an artifact would be a .jar file or a .var file or a .ear file. .jar files are basic Java applications and .var files are for web applications, and .ear files are for enterprise applications that can be contained in EGB containers. In NPM, the artifact file would be a .tar.gz file, and in .NET, the artifact file would be a .dll file. Now let's see what an artifact repository is. An artifact repository is a repository which can store multiple different versions of artifacts. Each time the war file or tar.gz file is created, it is stored in a server dedicated for the artifacts. Suppose you have compiled your source code and you have taken all the resources and dependencies with that source code and packaged into one artifact. This will be your application. After you create your artifact for the version 1, you store it in your artifact repository. And if the artifact is deemed worthy, it can go ahead for deployment. And then later, when you create a version 2 for the same thing, you can go ahead with the deployment again. And same with the version 3, where you can go with the deployment again. An artifact repository will store all these artifacts so that we can use them whenever we want. Now, suppose in a case where artifact 3 or artifact version 3 has an error after deployment. So we need to do a rollback now. Now, unlike the normal method where we have to go back to our VCS, example git, and then remove latest commit and go back to the previous commit and then compile the whole code again, what we can do in this case is that we can just roll back the artifact itself. We don't have to compile it again. We don't have to build all the files again. We just have to pull the artifact or pull the deployment file back and then just launch the previous artifact. Guys, now that we have understood what an artifact is and what an Artifactory repository is, we can go ahead and see what a Nexus repository is. Nexus repository is a tool used in DevOps methodology for multiple purposes. One of its main purpose is to store artifacts that are readily deployable code, which we learned before, that have been created in the code pipeline. Another one of its purpose is to act as a sort of buffer for downloading dependencies for the build tool and languages. Basically, Nexus is a repository manager. It's an artifact repository manager. It does what a normal artifact repository would do. It stores artifacts and then it deploys them based on need. Now, it also has one more feature where it manages and downloads dependencies for the build tool. Like how we learned about Maven, where Maven downloads and manages the dependencies. If we use a Nexus repository, in this case, Nexus would be connected to a build tool and it would understand the needs and requirements through the build tool. In this case, the build tool won't be managing and downloading the dependencies. Here, Nexus Repository Manager would be doing that. And since it performs so many tasks, it is very easily integrated into the code pipeline. First, your code will be created in your version control, and then it will be sent to the build tool for being converted into a source code, for being converted into binary code, and then it will be compiled with the dependencies which are gotten from the Nexus Repository Manager and compiled into one big artifact, which will be again stored in the Nexus. And it is also connected to the continuous integration tool, which could be your TeamCity or Jenkins or Bamboo, depending on what your company is using. And it also connects to the containers and the deployment tool so that it can easily deploy the artifacts that have been stored in the Nexus. What are the Nexus repository responsibilities? Like we learned earlier, first, it helps in storing readily deployable code, which are the artifacts. What are the Nexus repository's responsibilities? Like we looked earlier, the first responsibility is it helps in storing readily deployable code. That is your artifact. If you have created an artifact for your version 1 of your application, you go ahead and push it to your Nexus repository. And if it is deemed worthy, then it can go ahead for deployment. And same with the version 2 of the artifact. You can go ahead for deployment, and same with artifact version 3, we can go for deployment. Now, in case there needs to be a rollback, it's as easy as pulling the version 3 back and pushing the version 2 of the artifact for deployment. It is not the same as a version control system for source code, where the latest code is always replaced by the next code. Whereas in a Nexus or in an artifact repository, artifacts are always stored, they're not replaced. So there's no overriding done over here. So the next responsibility of Nexus is it helps in downloading and managing dependencies. Now, after your build tool reads through the configuration file, that is your configuration file for building your source code, it understands what the dependencies are, and then it tells those requirements to the Nexus. It asks the Nexus for dependencies. Nexus reads them, it goes to the remote repository and gets those dependencies, and it stores them inside a local server so that it can be used by the build tool to build the source code. Now that we've understood what Nexus repository is, we can go ahead and see what are the features of Nexus repository. Altation crowd support, staging and build promotion, tagging, and user token support. Now let's see all of them one by one. Altation crowd support. Nexus provides support for Altation Crowd, which is a security software that is used to manage and track user accounts and application accesses. It comes inbuilt with Nexus Repository Management Pro and can be easily configured according to an organization's needs. Basically, whenever you need to manage a lot of artifacts, you're handling a lot of sensitive data. You're handling the asset of a company. So if there is ever an error or there's a conflict in future, you need to keep track of who made that mistake or who was the person who pushed that code or deployed that code or deployed that artifact, etc. So for that, Nexus has third-party software called Altation Crowd Support that is built into it, which helps in managing and tracking all of these things. Staging and build promotion. Nexus provides a staging feature that can be easily integrated with an organization's software development lifecycle. It helps in staging all the release candidates that are the components of the software that are tested meticulously before being isolated for release onto production stage. So what this basically means is that Nexus provides us a platform where we can have candidates, and these candidates are then tested meticulously before they're isolated for a release onto the production stage. That is, before they're sent for actual production and actual deployment as an application. So it allows us to keep multiple candidates instead of just having one candidate. So you can manage different projects and have different artifacts for different applications on one stage before they're isolated for deployment. Since the feature allows for multiple candidates to be staged at the same time, then based on requirements, the candidates can be discarded or promoted. Once all these different candidates for the applications are pushed to the platform, they can be discarded. That means they can be removed if they don't meet the requirements of that application. Or they could be promoted. If they meet all the requirements, then it's all good and they can be sent for deployment as the application. Nexus provides the ability to tag components so they can be associated with each other. The usage of this feature is entirely up to the user, as it has no specific use case, but it's mostly used in life cycles to keep track of different builds or for differentiating between multiple projects during mergers. What this basically means is that Nexus gives us the ability to tag different components of a particular application so that they can be associated with each other. But what is being said is that this feature is mostly used for keeping track of different builds or different projects during mergers. Suppose you have different projects which are now to be merged into a single big project. So to keep track of that, we need to use the tagging feature. Or if you have different builds on the same platform, you need to make sure which build is associated with which build, or which build is going to be pushed for deployment next. So for that reason, Nexus provides us with the ability of tagging. For example, a release manager provides approval for a test phase and promotion phase, and only then will they be sent to the Nexus manager to be stored. User token support. Nexus uses a two-part token system to overcome the limited security of the build tools and removes the need to store sensitive information in text format. What this basically means is that whenever you connect your Maven to your Nexus, you're storing essential information, like you're storing your username, you're storing your password inside a settings.xml file, because you need this file to connect your build tool to your Nexus. Example of Maven.
Just a quick info, guys. Intellipaat provides DevOps online training validated and certified by NASSCOM Future Skills and IBM. The course link is given in the description below. Now, let's continue with the session.
You'll be storing the username and the password that you need to use to connect to Nexus inside a text file. And it is written in plain text, which is a security liability. If anyone acquires this file, they can know what your password and your username is and cause a lot of trouble. So to avoid such a problem, Nexus uses the feature of two-part token system, which eliminates the need of having credentials at all. Basically, whoever has the tokens can access Nexus. There are some other features also for Nexus, like high availability, repository health check, enterprise support, and group blob stores. High availability. Nexus has a feature called high availability clustering that keeps multiple redundant nodes inside the data center to increase the availability of the artifacts and dependencies in case any one of the node crashes or becomes unavailable due to some reason. So what this basically means is that whenever Nexus stores any artifacts, it does so in a high availability clustering. That means it stores it on multiple nodes. In case one of those nodes crashes or becomes unavailable due to some reason, then you can still access those artifacts using one of the other nodes. Now this is very important in case you need to run your artifacts, in case you need to deploy artifacts and you don't have the availability, then it's a big problem. You have a deadline and you have to finish it, but you can't because your node's down. In case of Nexus, there are multiple nodes, so that if one node crashes, you can still use other nodes. Repository health check. Nexus can recognize security risks in the code at an early stage. The features that it uses for the particular purpose does mainly three things. First, it provides guidance on what has to be upgraded and what has to be reworked and replaced. Basically, repository health check tells you what component of your code is old and needs to be upgraded. Otherwise, there might be a security risk, or it might not be very efficient and it might slow down your whole process. So repository health check tells you about it. This is the feature of Nexus. The second thing it does is it lists down components of the software based on their susceptibility and also lists the number of times the component has been downloaded. Basically, it lists all the components down in a rank-based system where the highest ranked component would be the one that is most vulnerable, and it also lists the number of times each component has been downloaded. So the third thing it does is it gives monthly summarized reports on the health of the code pipeline, revealing any dangerous trends or vulnerabilities. Basically what it does is it goes through your code pipeline and it lets you know at the end of every month with a summarized report whether there is an issue with the code pipeline or not, whether there are any vulnerabilities, and whether it is inefficient or not. Enterprise support. Nexus also provides a full-time support of a skill team focused on resolving issues. Now, when you're working with open source softwares, you don't have any guarantee when you have errors. Suppose you're using an open source software and you have deployed your application, but now it crashes and you have to figure out what the error is. And when you read the error and you can't solve it, there's no one you can depend on. But since you will be paying for Nexus Pro, you can have an assurance that there is a full-time support team that will help you resolve those issues. That's another feature of Nexus Pro. Group blob stores. Nexus provides a group blob store, which is a combination of multiple blob stores acting as one. Fill policies are used to select which blob store is used, and this allows users to have a choice in choosing and using their storage. Basically, whenever you download any binary assets via proxy repository or publish to hosted repository, they are stored in blob stores. Blob stores basically store any binary asset that you might need to use. When you have different blob stores, what Nexus does is it groups all of those blob stores into a singular blob store. That helps in accessing any binary asset that you may need. Now, fill policies are basically execution policy. That means an order can be executed only in a specific volume. If you want to execute order in one particular volume, then you can use a fill policy to execute that. Basically, fill policies are used to select which blob store is used, and this allows users to have a choice in choosing and using their storage.
Just a quick info, guys. Test your knowledge of DevOps by answering this question. What does DevOps stands for? A. Development and operations. B. Drive and operations. C. Digital and operations. D. None of these. Comment your answer in the comment section below. Subscribe to Intellipaat to know the right answer. Now, let's continue with the session.
Now let's see what are the difference between Nexus Repository and a JFrog Artifactory. So the first difference is Nexus uses a file system for storage and Artifactory uses a Derby database for storage by default. But in Artifactory, you can change that setting. Nexus cannot generate and save a settings.xml file, whereas in Artifactory, you can generate and save a settings.xml file. In Nexus, you would have to do that manually, whereas in Artifactory, it helps you do it. Nexus is limited in replicating repositories, whereas Artifactory can easily replicate your repositories to other Artifactory instances. So basically what is being said is that Artifactory can much more seamlessly replicate any repository that you may need to use and then store it in an Artifactory instance, whereas Nexus cannot do the same thing. Nexus has limited build time when it builds an artifact, whereas Artifactory has a faster build time. So it can access all its artifactories much more faster than a Nexus can. Now you still may be wondering why to use Nexus instead of Artifactory. Now that I've told you that Artifactory can be much better in certain scenarios. But the thing is, certain companies may need Nexus because they may have been using Nexus for a long time. And now that they have been using it for such a long time, it would be very hard to migrate from using one tool to another tool. And they may also be using certain other tools in conjunction with Nexus, which requires Nexus to be run. In that case, you would need to use Nexus. Now that we've understood what an artifact is and what an artifact repository is, and then we understood what Nexus repository is as a tool, we can go ahead and see the installation for Nexus. So the prerequisites for installing Nexus are having OpenJDK and having 2 GB of RAM and 15 GB of hard drive space. These are the at least requirements. For this, we'll have to open a marketplace CentOS again and launch a T2.medium. So let's go ahead and do it. But also in the end, it totally depends on your preference. Maybe you are more comfortable with using Nexus, or maybe you're more comfortable with using Artifactory. And there is no harm in knowing how both work. So guys, now that we've understood what an artifact is and what an artifact repository is, and consequently understanding what Nexus repository is, we can go ahead with the installation for it. Now let's look at what are the prerequisites we need before we can go with the installation. So the prerequisites are have OpenJDK, that's Java, and second is have 2 GB of RAM and 15 GB of hard drive space. So for this reason, we will go ahead and launch a marketplace CentOS instance. So let's head to our browser and come to our EC2 dashboard and click on launch instance. We'll go to our AWS marketplace, type in CentOS, click on the first AMI we get, continue. We need T2.medium, so we'll click over here, configure some details. We'll add storage of at least 20 gigs. Since we need 15, we'll go ahead and write 20 over here. We'll add a security rule, all TCP links, and source anywhere. Go ahead and launch it. Acknowledge, launch instance. If you go view your instances, it will be initializing. But since I've already created one before, I can go ahead and launch this one. I use my putty tool for that. Paste my IP address. Go to the appearance, make it 16. Colors, default background, make it green. Okay. Connection, seconds between keep alive 180. Authorization for my key, and then open. So it will ask for login as. I will type CentOS. Let's go full screen, clear the screen. Sudo su, so we don't have to keep typing sudo every time. And we'll go ahead and install Java. That is, the command for that is yum install Java 1.8.0 open JDK dev. Yes. Okay, now that we've installed Java, clear the screen. We have all our particulars that we need, all our prerequisites. We have Java installed and we have an instance with at least 2 GB of RAM and at least 15 GB of space. So we can go ahead with the installation of Nexus Repository. Now there are two ways we can go with this. We can go either directly to their website and download the file from there, or we can use Docker to launch a container with Nexus in it. Since launching Docker instance is much more easier, we're just gonna use Docker. So let's go ahead and install Docker. For that, we will need to install some packages. For CentOS, there is a particular step. There are particular steps that we need to follow while installing Docker. So let's go ahead and see what are the steps. So first, we need to install the required packages. So for that, I'm going to copy this command, yum install -y yum utilist device mapper persistent data LVM2. Come back here and paste the command and press enter. Now the next command is to set up a stable repository. I'm going to copy this command, come back here, paste the command, and it will say that repo is saved. And finally, we'll come back and we'll use this command. That is, clear the screen, yum install docker CE client, and container.io. This will install our Docker. So let's go ahead and click on enter. Yes, please.
Just a quick info, guys. Intellipaat provides DevOps online training validated and certified by NASSCOM Future Skills and IBM. The course link is given in the description below. Now, let's continue with the session.
Now that we've installed the Docker, let's make sure it is installed. For that, the command is systemctl status docker. This would tell us that Docker is loaded, but it is inactive. So let's go ahead and make it active. So for that, we'll type systemctl start docker. And if we see the status again, it will show us that it is active and running. Now that we have Docker running, we can go ahead and pull the image for Nexus. So for that, the command is docker pull sonatype /nexus. Now we'll press enter. It will start pulling the image for Nexus 3 and save it in your instance. And after it's done that, you can check for it using the command docker images. So we have our image sonatype Nexus pulled. Now let's go ahead and run the container so that we can launch the application. So for that, the command is docker run -d -p. We will run the application at 8081 port 8081. The name we'll put for it is Nexus itself, and we'll copy the image ID and press enter. Now we launch the Docker container. So type docker ps to cr container. Now we can see that the container is running at 8081 and it's launched Nexus. So now let's go ahead and access it using our web browser. Go to our web browser, copy the IP address of the instance you're using, go ahead and paste it. Type the port number, that is 8081, after 1:, and press enter. This should start your Nexus Repository Manager. And after it's started, you can see the dashboard for it. That is get started, repository formats, GitHub Actions, software composition analysis, etc. Let's go ahead and set up the admin. But before that, we have now completed our installation for Nexus Repository. So we can move on with the practice, that is hands-on for Nexus Repository. So let's see what are the steps we have to take. Nexus Repository hands-on. So the steps we have to take are, the first step, run Nexus Repository and set up the admin. Second, install the Git to get the sample code. And third, install Maven to compile and package the sample code. And fourth, connect Maven to Nexus. And fifth, check how the artifact versioning works in Nexus. So the first step, that is run Nexus Repository, we have completed that, and after that we have to set up the admin. So let's go ahead and set up the admin. So you come over here, click on sign in, and it will ask for your username and password. So the username will be admin itself, but the password is located in Nexus data admin.password. Now this says that it will be located on the server that you're using, but since we used a Docker container, it will be inside our Docker container. So let's go back to our instance and let's go inside our Docker container. So for that, the command would be docker exec -it, the container ID of the container, and bash. Enter. And if you type ls, you can see that Nexus data is there inside our container. So let's go inside it. Nexus, since that's where our password is stored. Okay, inside Nexus data, if you type this, you can see that admin.password is here. So we'll type cat admin.password. And this is the generated password that we will be using. So just copy it, come back to your browser, paste it as the password, and sign it. And then the setup wizard will come up. Click on next, and it will ask you for a new password so that you don't have to keep on typing that long hexadecimal password. Then we click on next and we'll ask you to configure an anonymous access. If you want to, you can go ahead, but it's not advisable to do it as it allows unauthenticated downloads and browsing. So let's go ahead and click on next and complete finish. Now that we have set up our admin, we can go ahead with the next step, that is to install Git and get the sample code. Now before we go ahead and get our code, let's go back to our browser and let's familiarize ourselves with the software a little bit. Now you'll see the gear icon over here, click on that. It will have server administration and configuration, and you can see that you have all your repositories over here, the public repository, and this is where your artifacts will be stored. You can go ahead and create a repository if you want. Then you have your blob stores where your binary assets, the ones you want, you can access them here. And then you have your security details, like what roles you want to set, what users you want to give access to, and etc. You can come over here and see support tools, and then there are system tools and etc. That's it for familiarizing. Let's go ahead and install our sample project. For that, we'll come back to our instance, come out of the container and clear the screen. And we'll need to access the repository from our GitHub. So we'll go ahead and so the project we'll need is in this link, https://github.com/sample Maven project. Copy this link, come back to our browser and paste it. So this is the one we'll need. Go ahead and click on clone download, copy the URL, come back to your instance, cd into opt, and type git clone and the link. If you ls, you can see that your sample Maven project has been installed. Now to compile this, that is the next step, we'll need to compile and package this. For that, we'll need Apache Maven. So if you remember the process for that, we have to go back to our web browser, close this, and type Apache Maven. We need to get the tar.gz link for this. This is the first link over here. Copy the link address, come back to your instance. Let's first install wget. So for that, yum install -y wget. Install wget for us, clear the screen, use the command wget and paste the link address of Apache Maven and press enter. And after your Apache Maven tar file has been downloaded, go ahead and untar it using the command tar zxf Apache Maven. Now if we see, we have a folder Apache Maven, it's installed, so we can go inside it and we can go inside the bin folder, clear the screen. So if we type Maven version, we can see if it's downloaded properly or not. Yes, it is. Now Apache Maven is only available from this position in this directory, so we need to make sure that it's available to all of the OS. So for that, we'll need to type export and we'll need to use an environment variable, that is path, and we'll set this path so that Apache Maven can be set in such a way that it can be accessed from all over the OS. So the command for that is export path equal $path : /opt/ Apache Maven, wherever your Apache Maven is, and bin. Press enter. Okay, now we're done with that. Okay, now that we're done with installing Maven, we can go ahead and configure our Maven so that it can be connected to our Nexus. So let's come out of the bin folder. Let's come out of the Maven folder. We'll have to create a new settings.xml file, like how we did in JFrog Artifactory. For that purpose, what we're going to do is we're going to find out what our home directory is. For that, we need to check which kind of user we logged in as. To check that, the command is id, and it will show you root over here. And if you want, you can just look at this part. That also tells you which user you logged in as. But you can type ID and you can get more detailed answer. We are inside this instance as a root user. We can go ahead and go to the root folder. This is the folder we need to go to, where we will create a folder, a directory called .m2. It's a hidden directory. Since it says that .m2 file already exists, if we type ls, we can't see it. But if we type ls -a, we can see .m2 since it's a hidden directory. Now let's go inside .m2. Inside .m2, we will create a text file called settings.xml. So I'm going to use nano settings.xml. If you do not have nano, you can go ahead and type v, or you can just install nano using yum install nano. So nano settings.xml, if I go inside, it says it's a new file. And here is where we're going to put our configurations for setting up Maven with Nexus Repository. So let me take out the command for that. These are the commands. These are the configurations. We'll set our ID to Nexus, put a username and password, whichever we have set over here. And we'll create a mirror to get our dependencies, to download dependencies using Nexus. So let's just copy this, come back and paste. Now make sure the URL you're using is the one with your IP address with 8081 repository and Maven public. If you want this, you can go ahead to your browser, click on the settings button, come to repositories, and this is your Maven public. You can copy the link for this. That is this one if you want, or you can just look from here. And make sure that your username and password are the same as the ones you entered while you were setting up the admin. Now we've made this configurations, we can go ahead and exit out of here. We'll save it using Control O, enter, Control X. Now let's clear the screen. And now let's go back to our OPT folder where we have saved our sample project. Let's go inside our sample project. And inside our sample project, we have a pond.xml file. We'll open the pond.xml file right now. Now that we have set Maven to be connected to Nexus, we need to make sure that the artifacts that are produced from Maven will be uploaded to Nexus. The first thing we did in settings.xml was connecting Maven to our Nexus. But in this, we're going to make the settings such that Maven uploads the artifacts that are produced after packaging the sample project, after reading through the code, onto the Nexus. So Nexus can act as an artifact repository. In settings.xml, what we did was we connected our Maven to Nexus. So in that case, we were making Nexus the dependency manager and the one that downloaded the dependencies. So let's go inside nanopom.xml. And if you come down after dependencies, you'll find this folder. You'll find these configurations, distribution management, repository, central, and all these details. So the ones we need to enter are different than these. So let's remove this. Now that we remove them, we can go ahead and copy our repositories that we'll need to connect. That are the Maven releases. We will store our released Maven artifacts, and Maven snapshot. We'll store the snapshot artifacts. Let's go ahead and copy these and come back and paste them. Now go ahead, Control O, enter, Control X to exit. Now we have a pond.xml file also configured, and we have a settings.xml file also configured. Now we can go ahead and see if it works or not using this command, mvn compile. As you can see, it's using Nexus to download the dependencies it needs instead of using Maven directly. Now if you want a different directory you want to access, you can use whichever you want. You can use NuGet group also, NuGet hosted also, and etc. We come back, we'll wait for this to download all the dependencies and compile the project. Now that we can see that the build is successful and the project is successfully compiled. Great, let's go ahead and clear the screen. Okay, now that we've compiled our project, now we can go ahead to the browser and see where the dependencies have been downloaded. We go back to our browser We are under settings. If we go back to browse server contents, click on browse, we will see a Maven public. That is a main repository. If we click on it, you can see that there are many dependencies that have been downloaded, like the JUnit, the one we needed, or log4j. And you have Apache, Sonatype, and Codehouse, and etc. So if you want to see which all dependencies you've downloaded and where, you can go ahead and click on browse and go under Maven public. Now that we've seen how Maven, when connected to Nexus downloads the repositories and manages it for Maven, we can go ahead and see how Nexus gets the artifacts. That is how Maven deploys and uploads the artifacts onto. Now before that, let me just show you one more thing. When you go back inside pom.xml file, you see that the version we are doing is 1.1 release. The difference between a normal release and a snapshot would be, whenever you mention this as snapshot, that means whenever you run the build using this pom.xml file, every time you build it, the same version gets updated on your Nexus. The same version would be updated. But if you make it release, each artifact would be stored separately. So sometimes if you just want to test something, you can go ahead and type a snapshot and you keep on testing that same release again and again. But if you want to make it a proper release, then go ahead and write over here release. And if you come down in the distribution management, this is where the links we will use to deploy our artifacts onto Nexus. We have typed the first repository as Maven releases. So every Maven release will be stored in libs release local. That every release that we deploy or every release that we send to Nexus. And in snapshot repository, only the snapshots, only the builds that we have created as snapshots, we have made them as snapshots, will be uploaded over here. All right, let me go back, clear the screen, and now let's go ahead and deploy our artifact. So see how it works. Okay, before this, there is one thing you have to make sure. Go inside your pom.xml file and go and make sure that the repository IDs that you're using are the same as the ones that you have put in your settings.xml file. In your settings.xml file, when you're writing the server, when you're writing under the server, the server ID is Nexus, the one we use. If you do not mention your ID over here as Nexus again, then you will get an error 401. So to avoid that, make sure that the ID you've been entering for the repositories is the same as the ID you entered for the server. Now let's come out, Control X, and we will use the command ambient deploy. This should download all the dependencies for your project, run the test cases, make the packages, and after it's done making the packages, and it should upload the artifact onto your Nexus. If we go to our Nexus on our web browser, and if we come under browse and look under Maven releases, since the version we entered was with a release instead of a snapshot. So if we come under release, then we can see that there is a new folder that is Flipkart offers and 1.1 release. If we want to simulate a change, we can go ahead, come back to our Maven project, open the pom.xml file, and inside then we can go ahead and make the version change. This will simulate a change that we have made in a project. Let's go ahead and save it. Control O, enter, Control X, clear the screen, use Maven, deploy again. Now if we go back to our browser, click under Maven releases again, you will see that there are two packages. There is 1.1 release and 1.2 release. We can go ahead and do the same thing with snapshot. If we go inside our pom.xml file again, and if we go ahead and make it from 1.2 release to 1.2 snapshot, and make sure that snapshot is in all capitals, and make sure that the URL you're using is the exact correct one. So we will go ahead and save this and exit, clear the screen, type ambient deploy, enter, and we'll go ahead and deploy the snapshot artifact onto our Nexus. So if we come here, refresh, click on ambient snapshot, Maven snapshots, and you can see under Flipkart offers, there's 1.2 snapshot. So guys, we have correctly learned how to use Nexus. We have familiarized ourselves with Nexus. Now we know how to connect our Maven to the Nexus, and we know how to upload our artifacts from Maven to Nexus. And we also know that Nexus now acts as a dependency downloading manager for Maven. So guys, that's it for today.
Just a quick info guys. Intellipaat provides DevOps online training validated and certified by NASSCOM Future Skills and IBM. The course link is given in the description below.
Okay guys, we've come to the end of this session. I hope this session was helpful and informative for you. If you have any queries, leave a comment down below.